and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs latest hashtag IE isolation video with me, Emily Carver. Before we start today's episode on China, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast, and follow us on Twitter to hear more from our experts during these testing times. Questions have been raised over the conduct of the Chinese government in the weeks after the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. China has been widely criticised for covering up the initial outbreak and has since adopted mask diplomacy, sending medical supplies and flying Chinese medical teams to foreign countries to help them fight COVID-19. Foreign affairs think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, has argued that the Chinese Communist Party must be held to account for its misconduct and that the international community should find ways to seek financial compensation from the Chinese regime. They say that the UK could have a claim worth a potential £350 billion in damages based on formally announced government spending. But is there really a case for legal redress here? Or can the Chinese government that began by suppressing information, began by claiming that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission, and engaged in disinformation campaigns to obscure the origins of the virus, now reinvent itself as the model for taming it? And will such actions stop the international community from attempting to hold the Chinese Communist Party to account? I'm delighted to be joined today by economic historian and head of education at the IEA, Dr. Steve Davies. And from the Henry Jackson Society, we have Sam Armstrong, who co-authored the report Coronavirus Compensation. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Sam, let's start with you. So the report clearly struck a chord with both the media and the wider public, I think it's fair to say. It appears there's an appetite to see China held to account for its misconduct. Could you start by telling us a little bit about your findings and why you believe the Chinese government's mishandling of the virus warrants such a response?
Well, the first thing to start with when it comes to misconduct is working out precisely what China did wrong and against which standards. So in particular, of the laws and rules and regulations that exist around healthcare matters, we looked at a document called the International Healthcare Regulations. They were passed in 2005 after the last time a coronavirus outbreak struck with the SARS outbreak of 2002-2003. And they impose a series of restrictions or conditions on countries. There's 196 signatories to them. And in particular, when it comes to potential pandemic scenarios, they require that a country, a member party, as they're called, hands over information in around about 8 or 9 categories to the World Health Organization, and they do so within a specified time. So basically, most countries have 48 hours from when they've identified patterns at a local level to have analysed it at the national level, and then a further 24 hours to report it to the World Health Organization. Now, we examined, using original source material and some journalistic material, China's response against those standards in particular. And what we found is, firstly, that China failed to uphold those standards, principally by deliberately underplaying the very early start of the pandemic. So they didn't cotton on or didn't report the fact that they knew that there was a SARS type virus circulating in December. And then when they finally did, they failed to hand over evidence that they had of human to human transmission for a period of up to 3 weeks, we say. In fact, some evidence now suggests that it could in fact be even longer. And then we examine what the consequences of that were. And we look at the UK nerve tag. So that's the new and emerging respiratory virus threats advisory group minutes, and see how that affected our ability to respond. And we find that basically all through January and February, that crucial period, the UK response, which I presume is typical of the Five Eyes, was severely hampered by the lack of Chinese provided information. When we've done that, we then suggest that there is a case that China ought to be held accountable, and then we look at how it might be. And we suggest 10 potential legal avenues. They have a varying range of or prospects of success between them, which Western countries or indeed Western individuals and corporations could seek to take action against China under. Now, some of these, it's fair to say, are outside chances. Some of them are a little bit better, but there are great problems in international and domestic law in trying to take action against a foreign state. There's some precedent, but not a lot. And at the end, we suggest that the figure that governments could claim tallies at least what they've announced in government spending, which was at the time of writing about £3.2 trillion for the Five Eyes. For the G7, and it's probably now substantially larger than that.
Yeah, so I know the paper, and I think a paper that you cite in the report is from the University of Southampton, and it argues that the Chinese government could have prevented up to 95% of the coronavirus infections globally if Beijing had listened to the Wuhan whistleblowers. And this is a question to both of you, really. We live in a globalized world. Could the Chinese government, whatever it did or didn't do, ever have prevented the spread of this disease? Is it fair to lay the blame squarely at their feet?
Well, can I say something first there? Yes, I think it is. It's very clear from the evidence, not just in this report, but the other evidence that's been coming out generally, that the Chinese government failed to take timely action, and then more importantly, failed both to tell other governments and the WHO fully what was going on, and did not impose travel restrictions. That's the really crucial step that they failed to take. And because they didn't impose travel restrictions, given that this was happening around the time of Chinese New Year, which is probably the second largest movement of people on the planet after the Hajj, that really was a major disaster. It meant that the virus escaped and got out all over the world. And with a viral pandemic of this kind, the crucial thing to do is to actually identify the spread and transmission at the earliest possible date, so that you're not overwhelmed by the number of secondary cases that are being produced. So yes, they were seriously to blame in that regard. Now, I would divide the story that Sam's just told into two parts. I think that in the first stage, what was actually going on was something which shows the way in which the Chinese state works or doesn't work, and reflects the incentives on bureaucrats in China, which is basically to cover your backside and lie about things to your superiors. So I think what was going on initially was quite straightforwardly an attempt by middle and lower level officials to cover up what was going on. Then finally, the Chinese state did get a handle on it. So the first phase, you might say, is cock up and bureaucratic misdeeds. The second phase is much more serious. That's the phase that Sam was talking about, where the Chinese national government failed to transmit the information in a timely way, and then also failed to take action both internally and with regard to movement that would have checked the spread of the virus. So there's been a very serious, there's no doubt at all, I think, that there's been some very serious failings and misconduct on the part of the Chinese state, the Chinese Communist Party and its leadership.
Yeah, I know, Steve, that you're a bit more skeptical of the case for legal redress. Could you explain a little bit why and how else we could sort of hold China to account?
Yeah, there's no doubt that the Chinese, if you like, if they were a private corporation or a subject to standard law, they would be liable for an amazing amount of lawsuits and damages. The problem, of course, is that they're a sovereign state. And sovereign states are, by definition, not subject to a higher law. They are the creatures that create the law. The only law that governs sovereign states is the kind of international agreement that Sam referred to, which sovereign states enter into voluntarily. They agree to be bound by them, and which they can, if they wish, derogate. They can decide that they're going to leave the agreement, break it, or formally renounce their obligations under it. Now, what that means is that I think it's wrong to think of getting redress from a sovereign state through the legal mechanism, because ultimately you're dealing at the global level, international society, with a fundamentally lawless system, actually, because the only laws that exist are the ones that sovereign states voluntarily agree to be bound by. So I think the question of trying to get some kind of response from the Chinese comes down to realpolitik, basically. I think governments around the world, and it's governments that have to take the action, I think, have to make it very clear to the Chinese Communist Party that they are going to be made to pay some kind of political or economic price for this, which involves not so much legal action as a change in various kind of policies. But that in turn is a difficult question because there might be cost to that. Finally, what could be done, but this would require the agreement of the Chinese state, is to put the claims to a neutral arbitrator. There is precedent for this in history, and the arbitrator would be another country, maybe someone like Switzerland, for example, that would be trusted by both the rest of the world and the Chinese. And the arbitrator could then award, come up with an award and say, yes, you need to pay out this much. That, however, would require the prior agreement of the Chinese state because they are a sovereign power. Personally, I doubt they would agree for cultural reasons.
Yeah, Sam. So is that something that you look at in your report? You offer 10 different potential legal avenues for action. Which, in your view, is the most compelling? And do you agree with Steve?
Yeah, so I think Stephen puts it in a really sensible way in that you've got to separate domestic avenues from international law avenues. So there are some precedents in domestic law for taking action against sovereign states. So there are certain specified exemptions. Now, the broadest exemptions are in the United States, where for over a number of years, a number of plaintiffs who are families of victims of 9/11 have tried to sue the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for its assistance or involvement in the 9/11 attack. Now, originally the claim was thrown out. So in response, the US Congress passed a law that increased the exemptions to the Foreign States Immunities Act. So there are potential actions in the United States. There's some talk, I think, in fact, there is already a bill in the House that would extend exemptions in this case. And then, of course, there's a separate matter, of course, which is the Hong Kong courts, in which it's actually an independent or quasi-independent judicial system within the Chinese system. So as remote as that sounds, there could actually be some form of justice in China. But realistically, this is much more likely, as Stephen says, to come out through the international mechanism. And China did agree to be bound by the conditions of international health regulations. Now, the difficulty is that while they do contain a arbitration or dispute resolution mechanism, which is arbitration launched by the WHO in accordance with the rules of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, what China did not do, nor did any other country, is accept those to be binding. So while it is perfectly possible that a country could bring China to the WHO, China would be well within its rights legally to ignore them. Now, part of the game of international law is finding one of the relatively small number of treaties in which countries like China, who've done all that's possible to avoid mandatory legal accountability, has signed up to. So there are a number of those, for example. So there's action at the World Trade Organization. There's action under the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, although I'll come back to that example. And there's a small number of cases in which countries have agreed to mandatory actions at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, International Court of Justice. And finally, there's actions under bilateral investment treaties in which countries have agreed to arbitration, again there under the UN's settlement system at Geneva. Now, some scholars have suggested that there is an interesting method in that while the international health regulations are not bound by mandatory dispute resolution, the constitution of the World Health Organization is through the International Court of Justice. So it might be possible to transpose those claims. There's other imaginative methods, like perhaps suggesting that China failed to uphold rights to safe maritime passage at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. There's similar trade methods. So there's a whole manner of inventive methods that public international lawyers who specialize in playing the game of engaging a treaty they really want to sue somebody under through the prism of another one that wasn't designed to do that, but nevertheless is useful because it has a binding dispute resolution mechanism. And then finally, as Stephen says, there's the method of what's called a commission of inquiry, or an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which could offer a route for other UN bodies to refer questions on the basis of agreed facts to the ICJ or to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, in which a non-adversarial route could be taken. So, in summary, there's lots of options.
Mm-hmm.
None of them necessarily have a greater than 50% success rate, but some of them have a potential of success. And then, of course, there's a question of whether, even if they didn't have the potential of success, whether countries in the West ought to bring claims in order to say that China would dismiss out of hand, in order to say, look, to make the political point that what China did was wrong, and to have some kind of international legal endorsement for that position.
Right. Could I just respond to that? I mean,
Yeah,
I think
of course.
that the last point there that Sam makes is actually the most important one. I can imagine that governments around the world are indeed going to lodge claims under these various enforcement treaties against the Chinese state, but they will do so in the full expectation that they won't get anywhere. This is more about politics. Now, what I would say is that what this does is to raise a fundamental issue of how you understand international relations, basically, because the kind of treaties that Sam is talking about, which have binding dispute resolution mechanisms built into them, are all part of a vision of international relations which thinks that the governments between the relations between sovereign states should ultimately be governed by law of some kind. The fundamental problem with that way of thinking and with the legalistic approach to international relations is that there isn't a world state, if you will. We do not have a Leviathan, in Thomas Hobbes's terms, an overarching authority that can keep states in awe, to paraphrase what he said. And so what this means is it's dependent upon sovereign states, including perhaps rogue states, voluntarily submitting themselves in the last analysis to a system of law. Now, the contrary view is the so-called realist view of international relations, which says, well, look, let's just take it as granted that we're living in a world actually where if states do choose to voluntarily obey the rules, all well and good, but ultimately they're self-governing and sovereign. And so what you need to do basically is work through straightforward cost benefit. You have to provide the state that's misbehaved, China in this case, with strong political and other incentives to do the right thing by making it clear to them that they're going to face a cost, basically. Now, that needn't necessarily be a diplomatic cost. It might be a cost of reputation, which I think in the Chinese case would actually be one of the ways to go, because in Chinese culture, reputation, standing is tremendously important. And if the message that's put across to Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is, look, you may get away with this, but believe me, your reputation will stink. You will be regarded as, somebody who's not reliable, not worthwhile. That actually will have a lot of weight, because that is something that they actually care about. So I think that thinking in terms of self-interest and ultimately realpolitik is probably a more effective way of trying to get what we do want, which is to get the Chinese to A, own up to the fact they've done something wrong, and B, actually make some offer anyway of recompense for the damage that their failure has caused.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. I mean, Sam, we've seen strong rhetoric, particularly from Donald Trump over China. This isn't new. Relations have been frosty for quite some time, I think it's safe to say. Do you believe that this will be an issue of reputation, as Steve says, that the fallout over the coronavirus will have lasting damage to relations? And looking at the sort of trade war mentality, could there be a more subtle, effective way of responding to this mishandling of COVID-19?
So to answer your questions in turn, what do I think this means long term for relations with China? This is going to be a step change moment. There's no doubt about it. In every measurable respect, in terms of death toll, in terms of economic cost, this is equivalent to the damage caused by a major war. Western economies will shrink by, something like 20% perhaps this quarter, though they might rebound. But there will be lasting costs. There will be tens of thousands of deaths in each major Western country. So this is the great difficulty of this case, in that in cases where there's a dispute between countries, one country does wrong and the two countries go to war, there's normally a surrender document at the end, and that country says, right, well, we messed up, so this is what we're going to do about it. Here we've had all of the cost of a war in which one country has imposed it on another country, yet there is no sort of prospect for a settlement, because there's, in fact, if anything, China is going to come out of this in an economic sense stronger than any of the other nations around. So in response to that, what I think you'll have is this bubbling resentment, both amongst the public and policymakers, that governments will seek to take steps to address. What does that mean? Is this going to be more of a trade war? Well, yes is the answer. I think there is now a global movement that is evident and to me at least, irresistible for policymakers to shorten supply chains, to introduce greater security, to supply of lines, to supply of critical materials, and to cut China out more specifically from the supply lines of what people are doing. So we've seen, stories about batteries and green technology, that China has gained an enormous dominance in the global market, and I expect one response will be that Western policymakers, including in the UK, certainly in the United States, and countries actually like Australia, which is an interesting example because it's had a free trade agreement with China for a while, will be trying to take action to introduce perhaps not tariffs, but some kind of method of bringing back quotas, so that China is not able to take such a crucial part in critical Western supply lines.
Yeah, Steve, are you concerned by this as an economic liberal?
Yes, I am. I think the trouble is, the kind of dilemma is, let's take Sam's point that in a way costs have been imposed upon the rest of the world by the failure of the Chinese state. The trouble is that many of the kind of measures he's talking about, and I agree with him, I think these are going to happen. They're actually going to be harmful to Western consumers and Western economies. Plus, the longer term thinking that you need to think about is this. I think we should not talk about China, this and that. We should always be very careful and talk about the Chinese state, basically, which we should not forget is an authoritarian, despotic oligarchy, basically. What we want to do is continue to engage with the Chinese people, if you will, the Chinese population in various ways, including economic relations, because I think the conclusion that we should draw from this is not that there's a conflict of interest between China, understood as the entire population of that part of the world, and the rest of the world, but that the Chinese political leadership is deeply untrustworthy on a number of levels. And so what we've got to be very careful not to do, I think, is to undertake actions for understandable reasons of shortening supply chains and things of that sort, which actually not only damage Western consumers, but also hinder the kind of interaction that we want to keep on having with the Chinese population, as opposed to their leadership, basically. It's a very fine line to walk, actually. It's worth saying, by the way, and I agree with Sam, I think this is an inevitable thing to happen, unfortunately. A lot of this reduction in the length of supply chains and reshoring of production is not going to be done by the policymakers, it's going to be done by private firms, because what this pandemic has done is to reveal, I think, just how fragile and susceptible to disruption a lot of these long supply chains are. And so companies may, for purely commercial reasons, think that they can't afford the risk of such a serious supply side disruption. And they will think, well, it's just not worth it, for that little bit of marginal extra profit. It's not worth running this kind of exposure and risk. So I think there is going to be a very big pullback. Now, what we might do, though, is things like, for example, competing much more seriously in geopolitical terms with the Chinese government over things like the Belt and Road Initiative and the large-scale investment sometimes by private capital, often by the Chinese state, in parts of the world like Africa, in order to basically buy influence. Now, that's not an economic calculation, that's a political calculation to do with geopolitical strategy. And I'm quite sure that people in the United States and elsewhere will be thinking about that. I think tariffs would be a very bad, as well as probably ineffective, way of going forward.
So I agree with much of what Stephen says there, particularly that I think actually the market forces will be far more effective at making these changes, and I've got no doubt that they will to supply chains. And indeed, they will minimise economic costs in doing so, because the market is far more effective at making these changes than our government policies. Now, the difficulty, I think, is with his first argument, which is that we've got to continue to engage with the Chinese people and separate from the CCP, which I completely agree with, the Chinese Communist Party, completely agree with. Now, the trouble is, for about 30 years, the West has had a policy of, if only we keep trading with China and get them involved in the global economic system, we will basically trade them into a democracy. That openness and economic prosperity will come a burgeoning middle class and more education, at which point the forces of freedom and hope and all the things we all believe in will become unstoppable. Now, the difficulty has been is the CCP, unlike its previous authoritarian examples around the world, has become uniquely gifted at taking the market forces, exploiting them and cheating in a number of ways where it can, but also taking that great wealth and using it to through a cyber surveillance system, build a system of state repression that is far larger than, or far more advanced than, anything that's been mounted before. And when you have moments like this, when the curtain is drawn back, it's difficult to say that the solution that we've had, this strategy that we've had to trade the Chinese people into overthrowing their government, is a feasible one. And you have to begin to look at, I know the IEA has done good work on sanctions and actually the effects they have on people. But clearly the strategy of just trading with China and trying to be open with China, encouraging China to open up, has not in any way weakened the Chinese regime. If anything, it has enabled it more. The Chinese regime of Xi Jinping is far more authoritarian, far more repressive than the Chinese regime was, say, 10 years ago.
Unfortunately, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's quite true that the Chinese elite, the oligarchy that rules China, has proved, as Sam says, to be very adept at using the material benefits it's gained from opening up to the world economy to create a system of state control in China, which has proved to be extremely effective, I have to say, in many ways. However, I would sort of go back to the point I made much earlier on. This is a process, if you will, the parties engaging, which can't go on forever, because the more you try to clamp down upon and control people's social interactions and other interactions, the less you know about what is actually going on. And this is a system which is plenty of precedents in Chinese history, actually. The old Chinese emperors used to have 4 or 5 separate intelligence services, the job of which was to tell them what the hell was going on in their huge empire. But after a while, with any kind of system like this, people lie all the time. And the result is that the people at the top increasingly don't know what is actually going on and don't know what they're doing. Now, I think the lesson to draw from the kind of story Sam says is that, yes, we do need to keep on trading with the Chinese, but that's not enough by itself. What we also need is more civil society engagement with China, people's diplomacy, as it used to be called, whereby Western pressure groups, civil society, gives aid and assistance to people in China who are trying to get around the constraints that the party is imposing. Now, the reason why private companies don't do this is because, of course, they want to make a profit. They don't want to annoy the Chinese elite and get thrown out of China. But that's not a constraint on Western civil society.
But it's
the Chinese state won't like it, but yeah, that's what we should do.
To that point, we've seen there's some in the West who are very willing to sort of lap up any narrative that's coming from China. That China has been able to quickly stifle the growth of this virus, and it's now helping the rest of the world to do the same. Do you think there's adequate enough skepticism when it comes to the Chinese regime in order to have this sort of civil society relations moving forward?
Oh, I don't know. What do you think, Sam?
Well, so I think there is a problem that people don't recognise that the Chinese regime is its history is one of a brutally barbarous, killed tens of millions of its own people, and we've conveniently allowed ourselves to forget about the evils of this regime. That is one continuous movement. Now, there's another problem that China's fellow travellers who appear, unfortunately, to circulate amongst the left in particular in this country are quite prepared to turn the blame on our own countries, and are very keen to talk about government failings, and when it comes to the UK, and certainly when it comes to the US, but aren't prepared to look at the failings of the Chinese state. But we also shouldn't forget that the Chinese state has a fantastically developed propaganda system that it has spent billions upon billions of pounds developing. And propaganda artists or propaganda mongers are good at what they do. So it's no surprise that some of it, i.e., selling back PPE back to the Italians that they sent there in the first place, worked because it looks good when China's sending planes in. But I think the West needs to have a much more active approach to resisting this. We are having a form of psychological warfare waged upon us as we sit here. Now, the solution is to both increase our defences and actually to increase our offensive capacity, so that China isn't able to get away with this with such impunity.
Well, I don't think that there's much need to worry at the moment about the military capacity of the Chinese state, at least not for the United States. Europe might be a different matter, but the United States military power at the moment is still way ahead of any other country, including China. So I don't think that's the area. What I do agree about, Wavy, is more confronting and exposing the nature of the regime we're talking about here. Now, I think Sam's quite right about that. But I mean, lots of people these days have heard about the Gulag. How many people know about the Laogai, which is the Chinese equivalent, which is still there, huge, the most extensive network of prisons in the world, really. But I think actually that although this phenomenon you described is real, I think there's actually been a bit of a turning away from that even before this pandemic started. So just before the pandemic broke, of course, there was a lot of coverage in the Western press of the reports coming out from Xinjiang of the treatment of the Uyghur minority, well, the majority in that part of the world actually, by the Chinese government. They're being herded into like huge prisons, basically. And I think that was the beginning of a turning point where people were beginning to become a bit more skeptical. I think that's going to get an enormous boost from the way the Chinese state has behaved. And so, yes, if you want to talk about propaganda and psychological warfare, yeah, we have been remiss in sort of exposing the flaws of the Chinese state and its record and what it gets up to. But I think that's something which we can address fairly quickly and fairly easily. I think we will actually.
Just lastly, just to wrap things up and just to get your final thoughts. It's no secret that obviously China wants to become a global superpower. Do you think that its global reputation, I mean, we touched on this earlier, but do you think its global reputation will likely be a casualty of this crisis?
Too early to say. It's very hard to say. I think it will be in Western countries. I think Western policymakers are going to be, or are at the moment, are privately livid, I would imagine, about this. What the effects in parts of the world, like say sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, will be, I honestly couldn't say at the moment. It'd be too early to say.
Yes, I think that's a very, very sensible way of splitting the question. We've got to realise that Tedros Adhanom, the head of the World Health Organization, was China's candidate, and he was for the WHO Director General role, and he was voted there by a number of African countries, in a large part who are heavily funded by China and who are reliant in a number of ways upon the Chinese regime. There has been this kind of shadow geopolitical war been going on around the world of almost a re-emergence of the old Cold War system of client states and proxies, and My worry is in great swathes of Africa, particularly Eastern Africa, the West has already lost some of those battles, and these are the countries that are likely to be the hardest hit by coronavirus. But it wouldn't surprise me if old anti-colonial messages became far more prevalent than a real recognition of where these countries in the crisis are about to find where their troubles came from, which was the Chinese regime that has so effectively captured their elites.
Thank you to both of you. That was a really interesting discussion. I hope everyone will agree. That was the IEA Head of Education and Economic Historian, Dr. Steve Davies, and Sam Armstrong from the Henry Jackson Society. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, check out our Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.